these things. So let me read from 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1. And the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod. When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. And when they of Ashdod arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon and set him in his place again. And when they arose early on the morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priest of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. But the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them and smote them with emerods, even Ashdod and the coast thereof. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us, and upon Dagon our God. They sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines unto them, and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be carried about unto Gath. They carried the ark of the God of Israel about thither. And it was so that after they had carried it about, the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great destruction. And he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and they had emerods in their secret parts. Therefore they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And it came to pass, as the ark of God came to Ekron, that the Ekronites cried out, saying, they have brought about the ark of the God of Israel to us to slay us and our people. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it go again to his own place, that it slay us not and our people, for there was a deadly destruction throughout all the city. The hand of God was very heavy there. And the men that died not were smitten with emerods, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Now, I think one of the words that we've heard recently that a lot of people are using to describe the situation in which we find ourselves in 2020 and 21 is unprecedented. And I think that most of us of any age can say that certainly is very accurate. We've never seen anything like this before. And some of us have seen quite a few things. I believe there may be certain prophetic implications to the times that we're living in. One of the phrases, which we'll look at a bit tomorrow morning, Lord willing, is a phrase that's found in the book of Revelation. It's the very first phrase that came to my mind when governments started issuing lockdown orders and shutdown orders. And it's that phrase that's found in the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation, that no man can buy or sell. Now, if that only happened in one country, we might think conspiracy. But when it happens worldwide, that economies are shut down, businesses are boarded up, and governments prohibit the buying and selling of services and goods and so on, it's quite something else. Now, hear me say that I'm not saying that this is that. I'm only saying that there are significant implications, that we can see parallels. Government shutting down churches. There's been quite an outcry about what's been going on in Canada, and it should concern us. And I don't mean to minimize that in any way, except to say that Canada has never enjoyed the religious freedoms that we in the United States have. And their government and constitution and so on is quite different from ours. So they haven't had the liberties that we have. And yet part of the very core in the United States of our, quote, religious liberty is that which states that the government cannot affect what we do as believers, can inhibit us, and so on. And yet, everybody says, well, we're all willing to do whatever for a few weeks to flatten the curve. Then the few weeks turn into a few months turn into a year. Who knows? So all I'm saying is that right, wrong, no matter what you think about it, it is unprecedented what's going on. The calls for vaccine registry, contact tracing, certain countries like Canada and other places where you rat out your neighbors if they're in violation of whatever the government, says folks should be doing. It's kind of ominous when you think about it. In our country, the suspension or the ignoring of the 14th Amendment, due process. And then there's the disease itself. What is God up to? Is God behind it at all? Is it a satanic attack? Is it something God's allowing Satan to do? One of the things we read over and over in this 5th chapter of the book of Samuel is that the hand of God was heavy against the Philistines. That whatever the particular malady was, the disease was, the plague was, it is directly linked to what God did to those people through whatever means he might have used. Is it a wake-up call? One of the things that's driven our behavior during this time of pandemic, I believe, among society in general, some among believers, but even among unbelievers, is the fear of death. And when the fear of death is so palpable, I have to confess at the beginning of this pandemic, I was a little bit, it's just a flu. More people die of the flu. Statistically, 99% chance you're not going to die of it, and all of that kind of a thing. And then all of a sudden, the statistics are not statistics anymore. They're names, like my brother-in-law, like my youngest daughter, who after 8 weeks is still struggling with lung issues. And so the death of friends, some my age, others younger than me, hospitalized. They're still on the low end of the percentage thing, but now they're not just a statistic anymore. Now they're a name, a person you know. Is it a wake-up call? Is it the Lord saying, well, there is something to fear in death? So those are some questions that come to my mind when we consider this pandemic. And what I've told Dan when he asked me about passing on to you folks what messages, I said, I've never been good at titling things anyway, but if I did title it, I would call this a Philistine epidemic. It wasn't a pandemic, it wasn't worldwide, but it affected the whole country. And you begin to read about these cities, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and so on. All of those were some of those 5 major Philistine cities of the day. And what happened in those particular cities. And so let's kind of think of where we are in 1 Samuel and see what was going on and see if we can gain a little insight from what God was doing there among the Philistines as well as with the Israelites, and see if there's anything that's applicable to the time in which we find ourselves living. So the first question, if you had never read the Bible before and you came to 1 Samuel chapter 5 and saw that the Philistines took the Ark of God, you'd have a lot of questions about that, like what is the Ark of God and how did the Philistines get it if it wasn't theirs in the first place? And those would be very good questions. Now, most of you, I'm going to assume, it's a dangerous assumption nowadays. I never, I'm not saying that to be cute or anything. I've gotten away personally from using the phrase, I know this is a familiar passage. I wish I could say that, but it's just not true anymore. I can't always say this is a familiar passage because it may not be familiar to folks as once it might have been. But I think with this group of folks, it may well be a familiar passage. And so you remember what happened back in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel when the Philistines were gathered together to battle. And there was that place Ebenezer again, very significant place now and would be in the future of Israel. And they joined themselves together at battle. And Israel was smitten before the Philistines. In chapter 4 and verse 2, they slew in the field about 4,000 men. So the people came into the camp, and the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant out of Shiloh, unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. And I want to tell you right there, they had already lost the battle. When the ark became nothing more than an it to them, because the truth is that it never saved anybody. Israel was not like the nations around them. They never were intended to be. And one of the things that was the significance of the nation of Israel, it's summarized in Romans chapter 9 in part of a verse that Paul says there, that unto Israel pertained the glory. And what that means, at least in part, is that one of the things that made Israel unique among all the other nations was that God, the living God, the true and living God, presenced himself in the midst of that people. And he sat symbolically, although physically, but it was a great symbol, upon the lid or the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, which was his symbolic throne. And you never know, Brother Phil, maybe one day I'll hit the big time and actually hit week 2, at the family camp. But anyway, be that as it may, one of the things that I do mention when I'm teaching on the tabernacle is that the tabernacle was never God's way of saying, let's see, what can I come up with to get those folks to understand what I'm like? It was God taking spiritual realities in heaven and bringing them down and put them into physical things on earth. So that everything you see in the tabernacle symbolically is representative or replication of what is actually in heaven. Why are there cherubim? Well, when you see the scene of heaven, who surrounds the throne of God? It's cherubim, right? Living creatures and so on. And so the ark was the place where God presenced himself in the midst of his people. And when they had reduced the ark of God to an it, well, they really had already lost. And there's a danger there, isn't there? Now, I said I wasn't good at titling. I'm really not. But sometimes if I preach on 1 Samuel chapter 4, I call it the God in a box mentality. Now, I was saved, as Phil mentioned, out of a rough background, which is hardly fully descriptive, but kind of gives you a little idea. Anyway, I was an unsaved person. And, when you're unsaved, you do all kind of weird things. At least some of us did. I did. And you had all kind of little habits and, things you did. So I know y'all never did this, but when I wasn't saved and whenever I went to a Chinese restaurant, you know what you did when you walked in the door? You rubbed the Buddha's belly. See, that's good luck. So I'm not telling you to do that. I'm not saying that's a good habit. I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying it was one of those weird little superstitions that you did. You rub the Buddha's belly. That was good luck, you see. And God in a box. So we keep him in his little box until it's convenient or until we need him. Then we pull him out to use him. God will not be treated that way. Now, God is merciful and gracious, and he has built into us as human beings what I call a sense of dependency. And when we get in trouble, I've heard the hardest men in certain situations cry out, God help me, like an automatic response, because there is within the human nature that cry for someone bigger, something bigger to help. And God doesn't mind that. He says we should call on him. And when we get in trouble, call on him and all that kind of a thing. But the difference is, you see, these people in covenant relationship with him, who treat him as though he's nothing but a convenience to use when they got in a mess. And so it was a time when things were messed up, as you read beginning in the first chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. Problems in certain family homes, problems with the priesthood, corruption in high places, and all of that. And so ultimately, they went to battle, and they took the ark, and they took the ark out. You'll notice how it's described in verse 4. the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubims. And the ark of the covenant of God, which was to remind them again of the relationship that was intended to be between them and their God. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all of Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews?" And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come into camp. Now, in some ways, not to be picking on these Philistine people, but in many of the accounts that we have of them in this section of Scripture, well, let's just say they don't come across as the sharpest tools in the shed, okay? In more ways than one. But you see, they were afraid because they understood the ark of the Lord is coming to camp. And so what do you do when the ark of the Lord is coming to camp? Well, what the Philistines did is says, we better really get ready and fight because God's in the camp, which is about the dumbest thing you could ever say. If you really believed God was in there, getting yourself ready to fight is about the last thing you want to do. But that's what they said. Be strong, verse 9, and quit yourselves, like men, and fight, because God's here. And but God wasn't there apparently, or they never would have got the ark, would they? He apparently had already abandoned in that sense. So they took the ark of God, and then they did what nations have done subsequent times and times before. They took the ark of God as a trophy. And they took it to the house of their God, because of course their God obviously had given them a victory, and their God was more powerful than the God of the Israelites, who was represented by the ark. And so they brought it home, and they took the ark, and they put it into the house of Dagon, their God, and set it up by Dagon. Now, I don't know what Dagon actually was. I've heard ever since I can remember that he had like the head of a fish in the body of a man, or vice versa, whatever it was. I don't know for sure. Now, the Ark of the God, one of the things about the tabernacle model we have is when people ask me the scale, I can't really give them a direct answer in that sense, except to say that some of the things we have are actual size, as far as we can tell from Scripture. So the Ark, the altar of incense, things like that are the actual size. It's not very big when you see it. So I'm sure that it sat smaller. And, here's Dagon, the big god, sitting there. Take the ark of the God and put it there in a subservient kind of way, because they conquered the God of Israel, you see. And then when they got up in the morning, they came, and Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of God, which has always raised the question, what do you do when your God falls down? What do you do when your God falls down? Well, you go stand him back up again, you see. Like I said, the Philistines weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. If you got a God you got to help stand up, you better find another God, you see. You got to help him out. That's not a God you want to bow to, you see. So they stood him up again. And then they came back in the next day. And he was falling on his face again, only this time his head and his palms were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump left. Wasn't much of a God then without his head and his hands. And so they made some kind of superstition. Don't ever step on the threshold of Dagon again. You see, and they still practice that to this day. Now, there's a bigger question, and Lord willing, if I'm careful with time management, we'll get to it, that develops out of this chapter. And I want to just put the bigger picture in your mind, and we're going to come back to that, Lord willing, at the end. Remember this, that now you have a situation where the ark is lost to the Gentiles. And the ark is now, the presence of God symbolically is among the Gentiles. And we're going to come back to that, Lord willing, in a minute or two. And so now, as they've got the ark of God there, what to do with it, you see? And so the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them. They got enough sense to kind of put together that it must be that it has something to do with this ark, because we got the ark and now we got this epidemic, you see, that's starting to spread. What are we going to do? We'll share the love. We'll send it to the next city, you see. You guys enjoy it for a while. So they start to pass it around in every city they send it to, almost to the point where they're thanks, no thanks. You guys keep it, But all of a sudden, these Philistines, they begin to get this. Well, I love the way the King James rather delicately describes the problem. They had emeralds in their secret parts. This raises all kinds of translational questions, doesn't it, you see? But get your mind thinking, you see. And so now you go again and you begin to think about the whole thing with the Philistines, and you realize that one of the ways the Philistines were referred to, of course, by the Israelites, is they were the uncircumcised. Now, pardon me, I'm not trying to be crude or crass. It's just important to understand that what in our day and age and in our culture is simply a medical procedure was not that back in that day. And if you were to go back, and I won't spend a long time on the history of it, except to say that it's always important to remember that circumcision was given to Abraham as a sign of the covenant and a seal and a symbol of the covenant relationship in Genesis chapter 17. What's important about that is a question that I often ask folks when I'm speaking. Even if you haven't read the book of Genesis lately, you'll be able to answer this question. Do you know what comes before Genesis 17? 16, Genesis 16. I told you you'd know. And you remember what happens in chapter 16? You know what comes before 16. Now you're catching on, right? Genesis 15. It's in Genesis 15 where Abraham believes God and is justified. And what does he believe about God? God says, Abraham, look at the stars. You see the stars? Can you count them? Because as many as are the stars of the heavens, so shall your physical descendants be. And Genesis 15 puts it very simply, very succinctly. Abraham believed God, and it was put down to his account for righteousness. But the Spirit of God in Romans 4 will analyze it more in depth. What was it that Abraham believed? And the Spirit of God in Romans 4 will say, Abraham looked at his own body, now as good as dead. He looked at Sarah, colloquial paraphrase, she was no spring chicken. She couldn't have children, but he believed that God could bring life out of death. It's the very heart and essence of the gospel of Jesus Christ that we believe. If you don't believe God can make life come out of death, you don't believe the gospel. Christ rose from the grave. And God can take our bodies as good as dead, spiritually speaking, you see, and give us life, eternal and everlasting. And so, time goes by. And one thing about time, I've learned this even, as thick-headed as I can be sometimes, I've learned, as time goes on, this is profound, so just strap in, buckle in for the profundity of the statement, okay? That as time goes on, you don't get any younger. It's the opposite. And Abraham and Sarah weren't getting any younger. And yet God had said you're going to have a physical descendant. And one day in the tent, they got to cogitating. Good Southern word, cogitate. And as Sarah cogitated, she says, Abraham, look, maybe we need to help God out. Because I'm not getting any younger, you're not getting any younger, it ain't happening. And, I know what? We'll take my slave girl, Hagar, And, will you go into her? And if coincidentally she happens to be with child, then, well, there's the answer, you see. It wasn't really a good answer, was it? It developed out of that. But anyway, that's exactly what happens. That's Genesis chapter 16. Why do I bring you into that history? Because it's very important to see that now in Genesis chapter 17, it's there that God gives to Abraham the sign of circumcision. And again, without trying to be too graphic, the sign of circumcision was a mark in Abraham's flesh to say, you in your flesh cannot produce anything for God. That your efforts of your flesh can't bring in the promise of God. And he gave him a mark. Not only would he never forget it, he'd probably see it every day. Circumcision. And he was to be reminded that the power was in the promise of God and what God would do for them, not what they would do for God. And the Philistines, they were the uncircumcised, which meant they weren't in the covenant relationship with Jehovah. And it is evidenced by the fact among the Philistines that they put their stock in brawn and brute force and what man could do. The bigger the man, the better. And they had some big ones, like Goliath. Now, how will God get the Philistines' attention? Will he bring a bigger man on the field? Doesn't have to do that, does he? What if instead of bringing a bigger man and making the battle about who's got the most bombs or who's got the bigger army, what if instead of God bringing brute force against the Philistines, he brings something so small that you couldn't even see it? A little virus. And he causes that virus to hit you in a very humbling part of your body, you see, which can bring down a big man, no matter how big he is. And that's exactly what happened. It raises a lot of questions. A virus. You see, when we read about this in chapter 6, we read there in verse 5, when they decide we're going to make these images of the mice that mar the land. You know the bubonic plague, you know how it was spread? Mice. Yes, something as deadly as a plague like that spread through mice. And somehow the Philistines put this together. Whether there had been this overrun of mice at the same time they bring in the ark, I don't know. But they put it together. And what would they do? Well, now, of course, you know what they did then. Philistines in chapter 6, verse 2, call for the priests and diviners, get the whole IT department in here, get all our scientists and technicians. We got to figure this thing out. What are we going to do? Well, they called in the scientists and they proposed an experiment. That's what scientists do, isn't it? Propose experiments, you see. Follow the science. And so they get these experts in there and they say, listen, if you send the ark of the God away, of Israel away, don't send it away empty. This is chapter 6, verse 3. You've got to return him a trespass offering. And I only want you to think of that now for a moment. How did they know? How did they know that there was a violation? And as perverted as their sense of it might have been, and what they saw as a solution, there was that knowledge that they had that this God is going to require a trespass offering. Sin must be paid for. And then they said, this is what we'll do. What will the trespass offering be? Well, there's 5 Philistine cities, 5 golden mice, and 5 golden emeralds. I have no idea what that looked like. Not sure I want to. But whatever it was, it represented, the tumors or whatever they were that were happening to them. And then they said, when you do that, remember, verse 6, don't harden your heart as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts. How do they know about that? The testimony, and this is a critical thing when it comes to the whole subject of part of the reason of why bad things happen in the world and atrocities and tragedies and things that are overwhelming and hard to understand and judgments of God as this was, as severe as the plagues were in the land of Egypt, that wasn't the only purpose that God had with them. And the Philistines heard the testimony of what had happened to the Egyptians and Pharaoh. They had a knowledge of that testimony. God used that, didn't he? And you'll remember where he used it in another case. When those spies coincidentally went into the one house where they thought, we can go in there and nobody will know the difference. Men coming and going out of there all the time. See? And they went into the house of Rahab, who happened to tell them, we've heard of what happened at the Red Sea. And I have come to believe that that God, your God, is the true and living God. I want you to make a covenant with me and promise me. And she came in ultimately into the line of Christ. The testimony of what had happened to Pharaoh. And so they said, listen, when you do an experiment, and I never went that far in school, but I do remember a couple of things that if you're going to do an experiment, you see, a scientific experiment, you have to have controls. If you're going to use a Petri dish, Petri, however it's pronounced, you don't want one that's been sitting around for 3 weeks with mold in it, you see. It's got to be clean, right? So there's no variance there. So you know if something happens, it's the real deal. And that's exactly what they did. They said, listen, take a new cart, brand new spanking new cart, fresh off the lot. Take 2 milk cows. 2 milk cows that have never had a yoke. And they have calves. Now, what they're doing is they're stacking the odds against any chance thing happen, which is the very thing they end up saying. They say, send it down towards the way of Beth Shemesh. And if it goes that way, this is verse 9, we'll know that it wasn't a chance. We'll know it was the hand of God that did this. And then they went and they watched and they locked the calves up at home and they observed what happened. Now think about it for a minute. They're going to take 2 cows that have never had a yoke on them. They've never pulled a wagon. They're going to do it without a driver. They're going to send them down an unfamiliar road. They're going to put their calves back and pin them up. And when those calves start bawling for mama, every instinct in those milk cows, who probably needed to be milked, is going to want to turn around and go home the opposite direction. Was there a power, even if it was unseen, that could cause those animals to go against their own nature for a higher purpose? Which is interesting to think about in the context, particularly of 1 Samuel, where one of the initial stories introduced us to 2 priests, sons of Eli, who did nothing but serve their own interest. When the function of the priest was not to serve their own interest, their own lower natures, but it was a higher calling, wasn't it, that they violated and they corrupted. And the cows, in that sense, observed a higher calling than those priests did. Interesting to think about. Now, why did God do all this? And this raises the big question. And you can turn to Psalm 78 while you're thinking about the answer to that. But in Psalm 78, we'll drop down to the latter part of it in just a moment. But except to say this, listen, here's the Philistines. And they propose this experiment. And God in heaven, of course, is listening. And God did not say, I'm not playing your silly, stupid game. What's the matter with you people? I don't need to show myself to you. Cart, emeralds. I don't care if they are gold. I don't want them. That wasn't how God did he? Oh. What caused those cows to go the opposite way from their calves, to go on that road without a driver, and they never had a yoke on them before? Why did the Lord do that? Was it that he might provide a witness to the Philistines of who the true and the living God is? Because God wants not only Israelites to be saved. And if it took an epidemic that blanketed and covered that whole country to get those Philistines to come to their senses so that they might know who the true and living God is, well, yes, God will even do that. He did it here. And when you come to Psalm 78, you drop down into verse 57. It says, they turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places, moved him to jealousy with their graven images. And God, when he heard this, he was wroth, and he greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. That's 1 Samuel 4. The tent which he placed among men, and he delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hand, which is the ark now being delivered over into the hands of the Gentiles. His glory, his strength delivered over into the hands of the Gentiles. And if that was a scene on that day, what was it that day on Calvary's cross? When the glory of God in the person of his Son, the Lord Jesus, when his strength was delivered over into the hands of Gentiles and sinful men to do what they would with him. And even though God's purpose had been planned in that thing, Peter would remind him it was with wicked hands you took and crucified him, the Lord of glory. Why would God give his strength over into the hands of Gentiles? And you know why he did it. He did it so that he might save the likes of me and the likes of you. Oh, the lengths that God will go to save us, whether it's by means of a plague, an epidemic, a pandemic, or anything else that he has to do in his grand design. But ultimately to prove who is the true and the living God, he's the one that gave his Son to die on that cross of Calvary, to take my place and your place, that he might save you and take you all the way to glory. That's the true and the living God. Our Father, we thank you again for the Lord Jesus Christ and these ancient stories that are true and historical speak at such various levels to us. They reveal to us your character. You weren't playing games with the Philistines. When they wanted evidence, you gave them evidence. What they did with that evidence, Lord, they were responsible. But they could never say they didn't have evidence. They knew about a trespass offering. They knew what had happened to Pharaoh. And now they saw your hand directly moving those cows in the way that you did, supernaturally, to prove that you are indeed the true and the living God.